there is a sign outside a new apartment building that says Now Leasing. And you assume, reasonably, that the company on that sign is the company that owns the building. That is what a sign outside a building normally means. Here is the problem. On a new building, that company is usually a property management firm hired to run the place. It does not own it. The company that owns it is often not the company that built it either, and the company that built it may already be planning to be gone. 3 companies, 3 different jobs, 3 different sets of incentives. And the one whose number is on your lease, the one you call when the lift is broken, is usually the one with the least authority to decide anything. There is also a phrase for the moment a building like this becomes worth selling. And once you know it, the way new apartments get built stops looking mysterious. The phrase is stabilization, and you are part of it. This is Policy Unpacked, where we read the documents that decide things and show you where to find your own. Quick scope, because it matters. This describes common practice in United States multifamily development. It is not a law, and it is not universal, and plenty of buildings are owned by the family that built them 40 years ago. Everything here is legal, standard, and has its own vocabulary in the industry's own textbooks. The building in this episode is a composite. No real address, no real company, no real lease. The mechanism is real. The specific building is not. And nothing in this episode is legal advice. What it will give you is a 15-minute job you can do on your own building using records that are already public. Start with the word because it is the one that unlocks everything else. In commercial real estate, a merchant builder is a developer who builds a property with the primary intention of selling it shortly after completion. Not to hold it, not to collect rent from it for 20 years, to build it and sell it. The word merchant is doing real work there. A merchant is somebody who deals in goods. In this arrangement, the finished building is the good. And there is a reason to work this way that has nothing to do with the building at all. It is about the money. A developer who holds a finished building has their capital locked inside it, earning rent slowly. A developer who sells it gets that capital back in one payment and can start the next project with it. The model is designed to recycle money quickly while separate companies handle the leasing and the running. That is the whole point of splitting the roles in the first place. And that changes something about the building that is very hard to see from the inside and impossible to see from the pavement. Think about how the incentives run for an owner who intends to hold a building for 25 years. They care about the roof because they will be replacing it. They care about the boiler because they will be paying for it. They care about whether tenants stay because turnover costs money every single time. Their interest and the tenant's interest are not identical, but they overlap a great deal, and they overlap for a long time. Now think about how they run for somebody whose plan is to sell in roughly 2 to 4 years. They still have to build the code. They still carry warranty obligations and reputational risk, and this episode is not suggesting otherwise. But the question that governs every decision is different. It is not, what will this cost me over 25 years? It is, what will a buyer pay for this, and what does the building need to look like on the day they value it? Those two questions produce different buildings, not worse ones necessarily, different ones. And the difference shows up in specifications rather than in anything you would notice on a tour. A worktop that looks excellent and wears in 8 years. A boiler sized correctly for today rather than generously for a decade of load. Landscaping chosen because it photographs well when it is new. None of that is cutting corners. It is all to code, all warranted, and all perfectly normal. It is simply built to a different time horizon than the one you are living on. So when exactly does a merchant builder sell? The industry term is stabilization. A building is stabilized when it is leased up and performing well. occupancy at a normal level, rents being collected, the operation running. And that is the moment it goes on the market. Now look at what that means for the people who moved in first, because this is the part nobody explains to them. A half-empty new building is a risk. A buyer looking at it has to guess whether people will rent there, at what price, and how quickly. A full building is not a guess. It is a proven income stream with signed leases, which a buyer can value with a spreadsheet instead of an opinion. And it is worth being precise about what the buyer is actually reading, because it is not a description of the building. It is a rent roll, a list of every unit, who is in it, what they pay, and when their lease ends. Your name is a line on that list, and your signature is what turns a projection into a record. So the tenants who sign those first leases are doing something more than renting an apartment. They are converting an uncertain asset into a certain one. That is not a conspiracy, and nobody hid it. It is simply what leasing up means, and it explains a great deal about how those first months are run. It explains the concessions. 2 months free, waived fees, a discount for signing early. Those are not generosity, and they are not desperation. They are the cost of buying occupancy, and occupancy is what the building is being valued on. And it explains something that puzzles a lot of renters, which is why the concession is almost always free months rather than a lower rent. 2 months free on a 12-month lease costs the same as cutting the rent, roughly. But the lease still records the higher figure, and the higher figure is what a buyer multiplies. A discount reduces the building's value. A free month does not. And it explains something you may have experienced without having a name for it, which is what happens roughly 18 months after you move into a brand new building. The management company changes, the portal you pay rent through changes, the maintenance number changes. Sometimes the on-site staff you knew are replaced within a fortnight. Nothing was wrong. Nothing failed. The building simply reached stabilization and was sold exactly as intended from the day it was financed. And the new owner brought their own operator. So let us name the structure, because once you can count the doors, the rest of this becomes obvious. 3 doors: developer, owner, operator. Door 1, the developer. Their job is to get the building finished, on budget, on schedule, and leased. Some of them have a construction company in-house. Others hire a separate contractor. Either way, their success is measured on completion and on the sale price. Door 2, the owner. Very often, this is not one person but a set of investors who put up most of the capital before the ground was broken and who may hold the building for a long time or a short one depending on their fund. After construction, the developer sometimes sells their own equity in the project back to those original investors, which means the building can change hands without anything visible happening at street level. Which is worth sitting with for a second, because it is the least intuitive part of the whole structure. A building can be sold without a single thing changing that you could photograph. No new sign, no new name on the door, the same staff in the same office. What changed is a line in a document about who holds which share of a company, and that document is not addressed to you. Door 3, the operator. The property management firm. They market the units, sign the leases, collect the rent, arrange repairs, and are the only one of the 3 you will ever meet. And here's the thing about Door 3. They do not set the rent. They do not decide the maintenance budget. They do not choose whether to replace the boiler or patch it for another year. They execute targets set by Door 2. So when you call about a repair that keeps not happening, and the person on the phone is apologetic and vague and genuinely cannot tell you when it will be fixed, you are usually not being fobbed off. You are talking to somebody who has been given a budget and no authority to exceed it by a company whose name is not on your lease, on behalf of investors whose names are not on anything you have ever seen. And it is worth saying plainly that Door 3 is frequently the party doing the most work for the least discretion. They absorb every complaint the structure generates and control almost none of the things being complained about. That is the ownership chain from the first file in this season, except that one ran through time, one owner after another. This one runs side by side, all at once, today. So where does this actually cause problems for you? 3 places, and none of them are dramatic. The first is the year after a sale. A new owner has just paid a price based on a projection and now has to hit it. That is when rents get reviewed against the market, when concessions stop being offered, and when the amenity that was a selling point becomes a line item. Your lease is unaffected until it expires. Your renewal is a different document. And that distinction is the one most worth holding on to, because renewal is the moment the new owner's arithmetic reaches you directly. The concession you signed on is gone, so your renewal is compared against a figure you never actually paid. The rent going up is only part of it. The discount going away is the other part, and the two arrive in the same letter. The second is capital repairs, a component with a 15-year life sitting in a building somebody plans to hold for 3 raises. An awkward question, and the honest answer is that the incentive to replace rather than repair is weaker than it would be for a long-term owner. That is arithmetic, not malice. The third is the one people find hardest because it feels personal, and it is not. There is nobody to escalate to. If your landlord is a person, an unreasonable situation can be resolved by talking to them because they have the authority to decide. If your landlord is a chain of 3 companies, then everyone you can reach is following instructions, and the person who could change the instruction does not have a public phone number and would not recognize your building by name. And that is not an argument for having a small landlord instead. A single owner can be arbitrary in ways a professional operator cannot, and there are real protections in a structure that has procedures. It is an argument for knowing which structure you are in, because the two of them fail in completely different directions, and the things that work on one do not work on the other. Which is exactly why finding out who they are is worth 15 minutes of your evening. So here is the job. 3 steps, no accounts, nothing filed, and every record involved was made public on purpose. Step 1. Your county or city property record site. Search your building's address, find the current deed, and read the grantee, which is the party that received the property. That is your owner, not the name on the sign, not the name on the rent portal, the name on the deed. And when you find it, expect it to tell you nothing. It will very likely be a name assembled from the street, a number, and 2 initials, and it will not match anything you have ever been given. That is not you failing to find the real answer. That is the real answer, and the fact that it looks like nothing is the most informative thing about it. Step 2. If that name is an entity rather than a person, and for a newer building, it almost always is, take the exact name to the business registry of the state where it was formed. Usually, the Secretary of State. Look at the formation date. If the entity was formed close to the purchase date or the construction date, it was very likely created for that single property. Step 3. Compare 3 names. The name on the deed, the name on your lease, and the name on the sign outside. If all 3 are different, you now know exactly which of the 3 doors you have been talking to, and roughly how far your question has to travel before it reaches somebody who can answer it. And one more thing worth checking while you are there. Look at the date the property last changed hands. If it sold about a year or 2 after it was completed, you are looking at the merchant builder model, and the timing of everything that has changed since you moved in will suddenly make sense. And you will also be able to predict the next one, which is the genuinely useful part. If a building sold 18 months ago to a fund, then somewhere there is a schedule for when that fund intends to sell it again. You will not see that schedule, but you can watch for the signs it is approaching, which are the same signs as last time: concessions disappearing, renovations to empty units, a sudden interest in the lobby. So who is behind the new apartment building? 3 companies, and the answer is genuinely all 3 at once. One built it, and in many cases built it in order to sell it. One owns it, and is usually a set of investors rather than a person. One runs it, and is the only one that will ever speak to you. None of that is hidden, and none of it is illegal. It has textbook names, and the industry writes about it openly in its own publications, which is where every term in this episode came from. What is unusual is that this vocabulary is written almost entirely for people buying and selling the buildings, and almost never for the people living in them. So the useful thing is not outrage, it is knowing which door you are standing at. When the person on the phone cannot help you, that is frequently accurate information about the structure rather than a failure of that person. And knowing that changes who you ask next. 3 files into this season, and each one has taken a layer off. The first followed one house through 4 owners. The second looked at who sets the price. This one counted the companies standing behind a single new building. But in every one of them, the owner turned out to be an entity rather than a person. So what actually is that entity? Next file. A request to fix a leaking tap and the paperwork behind the company it gets sent to. One property, one company, formed in a state the building is nowhere near for reasons that are entirely about liability and have nothing to do with your tap. This is Policy Unpacked. Subscribe and we will read the next one.